The morning mist clung to Brooklyn Heights like a shroud of uncertainty, as General George Washington stood atop the earthworks, his weathered hands gripping the cold metal of his spyglass. Below him, the waters of New York Harbor churned with an armada that would have made Neptune himself tremble. 427 ships stretched across the horizon, their British flags snapping in the August wind like hungry serpents tasting the air for blood. It was August 27th, 1776, and the fate of a fledgling nation hung in the balance. The largest expeditionary force in British history had arrived at America's doorstep, commanded by General William Howe and his brother Admiral Richard Howe. 32,000 seasoned troops, fresh from victories across the empire, now prepared to crush the rebellion that had dared to challenge the Crown's authority. Washington's Continental Army, barely 20,000 strong and composed largely of militia, who had never faced professional soldiers in open battle, represented all that stood between British tyranny and American liberty. The irony was not lost on the Virginia planter who had once served the very empire he now fought against. The Declaration of Independence, signed just weeks earlier in Philadelphia, had transformed what began as a protest against taxation into a full-scale war for independence. The British strategy was methodical and overwhelming. They would seize New York City, control the Hudson River, and split the rebellious colonies in half. With their naval supremacy, they could strangle American commerce and supply lines while using the port as a base for future operations. The city's loyalist population would provide intelligence and support, making it an ideal staging ground for reconquest. Washington understood the stakes perfectly. His army was green, under-equipped, and facing an enemy that had conquered nations across 3 continents, yet retreat was not an option. The political ramifications of abandoning New York without a fight would be catastrophic. The Continental Congress expected resistance. The French were watching to see if America could hold its ground, and the morale of the entire revolutionary cause depended on showing that patriots could stand against the world's most powerful military machine. As reported in historical accounts from the National Archives, the British landing on Staten Island had been a masterpiece of military precision, with troops disembarking in perfect formation while naval guns kept any potential resistance at bay. The Hessian mercenaries, their brass buttons gleaming and their discipline legendary, had particularly impressed observers with their mechanical efficiency. The Continental forces had spent weeks preparing defensive positions across Brooklyn, digging trenches and building fortifications under the scorching summer sun. The work was backbreaking, and many soldiers fell ill from the heat and poor sanitation. Yet they persevered, understanding that their earthworks might be all that stood between them and annihilation. Washington's intelligence network, led by men like Nathan Hale, had provided disturbing reports of British preparations. The enemy was planning a multi-pronged assault that would overwhelm the American positions. Through sheer weight of numbers and superior tactics, the Continentals would be fighting on ground of the enemy's choosing, against odds that would have made seasoned generals blanch. As the sun climbed higher on that fateful August morning, both armies prepared for what would become the largest battle of the Revolutionary War. The outcome would determine not just the fate of New York, but whether the American experiment in self-governance would survive its first true test of fire. And steel. The pre-dawn darkness of August 27th was broken not by birdsong, but by the measured tramp of 10,000 British boots moving through the forests of central Long Island. General Henry Clinton had conceived a masterstroke of military deception that would exploit the fatal weakness in American defensive planning. While the Continental forces watched the obvious approach routes, expecting a frontal assault, the British were executing a flanking maneuver that would place them behind enemy lines by sunrise. The Jamaica Pass, a narrow trail through the wooded hills that most American commanders had dismissed as impassable for large forces, had become the key to British victory. Local loyalist guides, intimate with every deer path and creek crossing, led Clinton's column through the darkness with the stealth of hunters pursuing prey. The irony was bitter. Americans were being outflanked on their own soil by their own neighbors who had chosen to remain faithful to the Crown. General Israel Putnam, the grizzled veteran of the French and Indian War, commanded the American left wing from his headquarters near the Gowanus Creek. His forces, primarily Connecticut militia and Continental regulars, had spent the night in nervous anticipation. The sound of British drums echoing across the water had kept most men awake, clutching their muskets and checking their powder for the 100th time. These farmers and shopkeepers, transformed into soldiers by necessity, understood they were about to face the most professional army in the world. The American defensive plan, conceived by Washington and his war council, was sound in theory, but fatally flawed in execution. The Continental forces held a line of hills running roughly east to west across Brooklyn, with their right flank anchored on the East River and their left extending toward the Gowanus marshes. The plan assumed the British would attack directly up the main roads, where American artillery and entrenched infantry could exact a terrible toll. No one had adequately considered the possibility of a wide flanking movement through supposedly impassable terrain. As dawn broke over Long Island, the deception began to unfold with clockwork precision. British light infantry, led by Major General James Grant, advanced along the coastal road toward the American right flank. Their pipes and drums announced their presence deliberately, drawing American attention and reinforcements to what appeared to be the main assault. Simultaneously, Hessian troops under Colonel Karl von Donop pressed forward along the center road, their distinctive blue uniforms and brass-fronted caps creating an imposing sight that fixed American defenders in place. According to military historians cited in the Smithsonian's Revolutionary War Archives, the British coordination was remarkable for an era when battlefield communication depended on signal flags and galloping messengers. Each column moved with precise timing, creating the illusion of separate attacks while actually supporting a unified strategy that would converge on the American rear. The first shots of the battle rang out near dawn as American pickets encountered Grant's advancing column. The sound of musket fire crackling through the morning air sent a shiver through the Continental ranks. This was no longer a war of words and declarations. It was a trial by fire that would determine whether the rhetoric of liberty could survive the reality of bayonets and grape shot. General Lord Sterling, commanding the American right wing, sent urgent dispatches to Washington reporting heavy pressure from British forces advancing along the shore road. The Virginia planter, who had become America's commanding general, faced his first major tactical decision. Should he reinforce Sterling's position or hold his reserves for the main assault he expected to come through the center? The choice would have consequences that would echo through the ages. Meanwhile, in the pre-dawn darkness, Clinton's flanking column had reached the critical moment. The Jamaica Pass lay ahead, its narrow confines defended by only a handful of American sentries who had no idea that 10,000 enemy soldiers were approaching through the forest. The fate of the Continental Army hung on whether these few men could raise the alarm before being overwhelmed by the approaching tide of British steel. The morning air exploded with the roar of artillery as British cannons, positioned on the heights above Flatbush, began their deadly symphony. The ground beneath the American positions trembled with each impact, sending showers of dirt and splintered wood cascading over the Continental defenders. It was 6 o'clock on the morning of August 27th, and the largest battle in American history had begun in earnest. General William Alexander, known to his men as Lord Sterling despite the contested nature of his Scottish peerage, stood resolute behind the American earthworks as British roundshot screamed overhead. His Maryland and Delaware Continentals, among the finest soldiers in Washington's army, crouched behind their fortifications and awaited orders. These men had volunteered to fight for independence, leaving behind families and farms to face the world's most powerful empire. Now they would discover whether their cause was worth dying for. The British assault began with textbook precision. General James Grant's column, advancing along the coastal road, deployed into line formation with the mechanical efficiency that had conquered nations. Red-coated infantry advanced in perfect ranks, their bayonets gleaming in the morning sun like a forest of steel. Behind them, Highland regiments in their distinctive kilts and feathered bonnets added their wild war cries to the cacophony of battle, a sound that had struck terror into enemies from the Scottish Highlands to the plains of India. The American response was immediate and fierce. Continental artillery, commanded by Captain Alexander Hamilton, sent grapeshot tearing through the British ranks. The young artillery officer, destined for greater fame in the political arena, proved his courage under fire as he personally aimed each cannon shot. His guns, though fewer in number than the British batteries, were skillfully positioned and served by men who understood that every shot might determine their nation's fate. The first British assault struck the American right flank like a thunderbolt. Lord Sterling's men, fighting from behind hastily constructed earthworks, poured devastating volleys into the advancing redcoats. The crash of musket fire was so intense that observers reported it sounded like the tearing of heavy cloth. British soldiers fell in heaps, their scarlet uniforms darkening with blood as they paid the price for advancing across open ground against entrenched defenders. Yet the British pressed forward with a discipline that spoke of decades of professional training. Officers, their swords gleaming as they pointed toward the American positions, led their men forward with the calm determination of men who had faced death in a dozen campaigns. The King's Own Regiment, veterans of European battlefields, advanced with colors flying despite the withering fire that thinned their ranks with every step. As documented in primary sources from the New York Historical Society, the fighting along the American right flank became a desperate struggle for survival. British grenadiers, the elite of their army, hurled themselves against the American earthworks in wave after wave of crimson-coated fury. The sound of steel meeting steel rang out as bayonets clashed and men fought hand-to-hand in the trenches that had been dug to protect American liberty. The Continental soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat before this terrible morning, discovered reserves of courage they had not known they possessed. A young Maryland private, writing in his diary after the battle, described the scene. The British came on like devils, their faces black with powder and their bayonets seeking our hearts. Yet we stood firm, for we knew that behind us lay our homes, our families, and our sacred honor. The American left flank, commanded by General Israel Putnam, found itself under equal pressure as Hessian troops advanced with their characteristic precision. These German mercenaries, fighting for pay rather than principle, nonetheless proved their worth as professional soldiers. Their blue uniforms and brass-fronted caps became a familiar sight as they pressed forward through the smoke and chaos of battle, their training evident in every movement. The sound of battle could be heard for miles as two armies, representing the different visions of the future, clashed in the fields and forests of Long Island. The British fought to preserve an empire that had ruled the seas for generations. The Americans fought for an idea that had never been tested in the crucible of war, that free men could govern themselves without kings or nobles to rule over them. Wow. The thunder of artillery and crack of muskets filled the air along the American front lines. A more deadly drama was unfolding in the forests of central Long Island. General Henry Clinton's flanking column, 10,000 strong, moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a serpent sliding through tall grass. The Jamaica Pass, that narrow gateway through the hills that American commanders had fatally neglected, was about to become the graveyard of continental hopes. The 5 American sentries guarding the pass had spent a quiet night, never suspecting that the largest flanking movement in the war's history was approaching through the darkness. These men, local militia who knew every trail and creek in the area, had been placed at this seemingly unimportant position almost as an afterthought. They represented the kind of oversight that transforms military campaigns from tactical exercises into national disasters. Dotted precisely 4 o'clock in the morning, the British vanguard emerged from the forest like ghosts materializing from the mist. Light infantry, trained in the art of silent movement, overwhelmed the American sentries before they could fire a single warning shot. The pass was now in British hands, and Clinton's entire column began pouring through the gap in the American defenses like water through a broken dam. The British advance was a masterpiece of military coordination. Engineers had spent the night clearing obstacles and widening the path to accommodate artillery, while guys positioned at regular intervals ensured that the massive column would not lose its way. In the darkness, each regiment knew its role in the grand design, and each soldier understood that he was participating in an operation that would decide the fate of the rebellion. As the sun rose over Long Island, Clinton's force had achieved the impossible. 10,000 British and Hessian troops, complete with artillery and baggage train, had moved through supposedly impassable terrain to position themselves behind the American lines. The trap was set, and the Continental Army was about to discover that their defensive positions had become a snare that would catch them instead of their enemies. The first indication of disaster came when American pickets, posted on the heights above Bedford, spotted British uniforms approaching from the wrong direction. The sight of redcoats moving through the morning mist where no enemy should have been was so shocking that some soldiers initially refused to believe their own eyes. Urgent messages raced toward American headquarters, but precious minutes had already been lost. General John Sullivan, commanding the American center, received the first reports of British troops in his rear with a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. The Rhode Island lawyer-turned-soldier had expected to face a frontal assault, not to find himself caught between the enemy forces with no line of retreat. His Connecticut and New Hampshire regiments, Brave men who had volunteered to fight for independence were about to face the nightmare scenario that every commander dreads, being attacked from behind while engaged to the front, according to military records preserved in the Library of Congress. The British execution of the flanking movement was so precise that it became a textbook example of tactical excellence. Clinton had not only achieved strategic surprise, but had also maintained perfect coordination between his flanking force and the frontal attacks being conducted by Grant and Von Donop. The American army was now caught in a vice that was about to close with crushing force. The sound of British drums and fifes, playing regimental marches, began to echo through the forest behind the American lines. These martial airs, familiar to every soldier who had served in the King's forces, carried a message of impending doom to Continental ears. The music that had once celebrated British victories across the globe now heralded the potential destruction of American hopes for independence. Washington, receiving the first fragmentary reports of enemy movement in his rear, faced the most critical decision of his military career. Should he order an immediate retreat to Brooklyn Heights, potentially saving his army but abandoning thousands of men to capture or death? Or should he attempt to fight his way out of the trap, risking the complete destruction of the Continental Army but perhaps preserving American honor? The choice would determine not just the outcome of the battle, but the future of the American cause. The trap was closing, and the largest battle of the Revolutionary War was about to enter its most decisive phase. The Continental Army, caught between anvil and hammer, would now discover whether the spirit of liberty could overcome the science of war. The morning sun cast long shadows across the battlefield as the full horror of the American situation became clear. At 8 o'clock, the sound of British drums thundering behind the Continental lines announced that Clinton's flanking movement had achieved complete success. The American army, caught between two converging forces, faced annihilation. What had begun as a defensive battle was rapidly becoming a rout of catastrophic proportions. General John Sullivan's brigade, holding the American center near the village of Bedford, found itself in an impossible position. British forces advancing from the front while Clinton's column attacked from the rear created a tactical nightmare that would have challenged the most experienced commanders. Sullivan, a New Hampshire lawyer with limited military experience, watched his carefully planned defensive positions crumble as his men were forced to fight in two directions simultaneously. The first units to break were the Connecticut militia, farmers and tradesmen who had never faced professional soldiers in open battle. The sight of British bayonets gleaming in the morning sun, approaching from directions where no enemy should have been, shattered their morale like glass. These men, who had volunteered to fight for independence, now faced the stark reality that courage alone could not overcome superior numbers and tactical brilliance. The collapse began as a trickle, but quickly became a flood. Individual soldiers, seeing their flanks exposed and their retreat routes cut off, began to abandon their positions. Officers, themselves confused by the rapidly changing situation, struggled to maintain order as their commands dissolved around them. The carefully constructed American defensive line, which had taken weeks to build, disintegrated in a matter of minutes. British and Hessian troops, sensing victory, pressed their advantage with ruthless efficiency. The redcoats, their scarlet uniforms now stained with powder smoke and blood, advanced with bayonets fixed and murder in their eyes. These professional soldiers, trained in the art of war on European battlefields, showed no mercy to rebels who had dared to challenge their king. The sound of steel meeting flesh echoed across the battlefield as British cold steel found its mark. The American retreat quickly became a disaster of epic proportions. Soldiers threw away their muskets and equipment in their desperate flight toward Brooklyn Heights. The roads leading to the American fortifications became clogged with fleeing men, abandoned artillery pieces, and the wounded who could not keep pace with the rout. The sight of the Continental Army in full flight was a spectacle that would haunt American military memory for generations. General Israel Putnam, the veteran Indian fighter who commanded the American left wing, attempted to rally his men as they streamed past his position. The old soldier, whose courage had never been questioned, found himself powerless to stop the tide of defeat that was washing over the Continental Army. His Connecticut troops, men who had followed him through previous campaigns, were now part of the general flight toward the dubious safety of the Brooklyn fortifications, as documented in eyewitness accounts preserved by the Brooklyn Historical Society. The British pursuit was relentless and brutal. Light infantry, trained in the art of pursuit, harried the fleeing Americans with a skill that spoke of long experience in hunting defeated enemies. The sound of musket fire crackled through the forest as British soldiers cut down stragglers who could not match the pace of their comrades' flight. The Gowanus Creek, a narrow waterway that had seemed like a minor obstacle in the morning, now became a death trap for hundreds of American soldiers, men who had never learned to swim through themselves into the water, in desperate attempts to escape British bayonets. Many drowned in the murky waters, weighed down by their equipment and weakened by wounds. The creek, which had run clear that morning, was stained red with American blood by noon. Lord Stirling's Maryland and Delaware Continentals, among the finest soldiers in Washington's army, found themselves completely cut off from the main American force. These men, who had fought with distinction throughout the morning, now faced the choice between surrender and a desperate attempt to fight their way through overwhelming enemy numbers. Their decision would write one of the most heroic chapters in American military history. The British victory seemed complete, but the battle was far from over. The American army, though badly mauled and demoralized, still held the fortifications on Brooklyn Heights. Washington, watching the disaster unfold from his command post, faced the most critical decision of his career, whether to attempt to save what remained of his army or to make a final stand that might preserve American honor even if it meant the destruction of the Continental cause. As the Continental Army dissolved into chaos around him, General William Alexander, Lord Stirling, stood like a rock in a storm-tossed sea. His Maryland and Delaware regiments, the finest soldiers in Washington's army, found themselves completely surrounded by British forces near the Gowanus Creek. Cut off from retreat and facing overwhelming odds, these men were about to write their names in American legend with their own blood. The situation was desperate beyond description. Clinton's flanking movement had succeeded so completely that Stirling's force of fewer than 2,000 men faced over 8,000 British and Hessian troops. The morning sun, which had risen on carefully planned defensive positions, now illuminated what appeared to be the final act of the Continental Army's destruction. Yet these Maryland farmers and Delaware fishermen, transformed into soldiers by the cause of liberty, refused to yield. Stirling, a man who had never sought military glory, but had accepted command out of duty to his country, gathered his officers around him in a moment that would be remembered as long as Americans cherished the memory of sacrifice. The Scottish-born general, whose claim to nobility had been disputed in British courts, would prove his worth not through legal documents, but through the currency of courage under fire. The first British assault came from the north, where Hessian grenadiers advanced with their characteristic precision. These German mercenaries, fighting for pay rather than principle, nonetheless brought professional competence to their task. Their blue uniforms and brass-fronted caps became a familiar sight as they pressed forward through the smoke of battle, their training evident in every movement despite the desperate nature of American resistance. The Maryland 400, as they would be remembered by history, formed the core of Stirling's defense. These men, many of whom had served together since the beginning of the war, knew each other's strengths and weaknesses as intimately as brothers. They had drilled together on the streets of Baltimore, had shared hardships during the march to New York, and now faced death together in the marshes of Long Island with a calm determination that would have done credit to the finest European regiments. The fighting around the Gowanus Creek reached a level of intensity that few battles in American history would equal. British forces, sensing that complete victory was within their grasp, pressed forward with savage determination. The sound of musket fire was so continuous that individual shots could not be distinguished from the general roar. Bayonets clashed against bayonets as men fought hand to hand in the marshy ground, where footing was treacherous and every step might be a soldier's last. Captain Robert Kirkwood's Delaware Company, positioned at the critical point where the creek narrowed, held their ground with a tenacity that amazed even veteran British officers. These men, fishermen and farmers from the shores of Delaware Bay, had learned their trade in the dangerous waters of the Atlantic. Now they applied the same steady courage that had carried them through winter storms to the task of holding back an army that outnumbered them 10-1. According to military records housed in the Maryland Historical Society, the British forces that converged on Stirling's position included some of the finest regiments in the King's service. The 23rd Regiment of Foot, veterans of European campaigns, advanced with colors flying despite the withering fire that thinned their ranks. The 44th Regiment, which had fought at Minen and other celebrated battles, brought their hard-won experience to bear against Americans who had never faced such professional opposition. The critical moment came when Sterling realized that his position was hopeless. Surrounded on three sides and with the creek at his back, he faced the choice that every commander dreads, to order a hopeless attack that would save honor, but destroy his command, or to surrender and preserve his soldiers' lives at the cost of American morale. The decision he made would echo through American military tradition for generations. Sterling's famous order, "We can but die here or be taken prisoners," became the rallying cry for one of the most desperate charges in American military history. The Maryland and Delaware troops, understanding that they were sacrificing themselves to buy time for the rest of the Continental Army to escape, formed ranks with the calm precision of veterans despite the chaos surrounding them. The charge across the Gowanus Creek was both a tactical disaster and a moral victory that would inspire Americans for generations. These men, knowing they were riding into the jaws of death, advanced with colors flying and drums beating as if they were marching to a parade. Rather than a slaughter, their sacrifice would provide Washington with the precious time needed to save what remained of his army and preserve the cause of American independence. The sun was setting over New York Harbor when General George Washington stood once again atop the earthworks of Brooklyn Heights, but the man who gazed across the water toward Manhattan was fundamentally changed from the confident commander who had watched the British fleet arrive just days before. The largest battle of the Revolutionary War was ending in catastrophic defeat, yet the most critical test of American independence was just beginning. The statistics of disaster were staggering. Of the 10,000 Continental soldiers who had marched into battle that morning, fewer than 7,000 remained under arms. Over 300 lay dead on the field, including many of the finest officers in the Continental Army. Nearly 1,000 men, including Generals Sullivan and Sterling, had been captured by British forces. The cream of American military leadership was now in enemy hands, and the Continental Army as an effective fighting force appeared to be finished. Yet Washington, despite the magnitude of the defeat, had managed to save the core of his army. The sacrifice of Sterling's Maryland and Delaware regiments had bought precious time for the remainder of the Continental forces to reach the fortifications on Brooklyn Heights. These earthworks, built with such hope and determination just weeks earlier, now represented the last refuge of American military power. In the face of overwhelming British superiority, the British, flushed with victory, had every reason to expect the rapid collapse of American resistance. General William Howe, commanding the victorious army, possessed overwhelming numerical superiority and the momentum of complete tactical success. His forces controlled the field of battle. His naval superiority made American supply lines tenuous at best, and his prisoner interrogations revealed the extent of Continental demoralization. The rebellion appeared to be in its death throes. The American position on Brooklyn Heights was hopeless by any rational military assessment. The Continental Army was trapped on a narrow peninsula, with the East River at its back and no means of retreat. British artillery could dominate the American positions, and a coordinated assault would likely result in the complete destruction of Washington's remaining forces. The cause of American independence appeared to hang by the slenderest of threads. Washington faced the most critical decision of his military career. A frontal assault on the British positions was clearly impossible given the disparity in numbers and morale. Surrender would preserve the lives of his remaining soldiers, but would likely end the rebellion and result in his own execution as a traitor. The only alternative was retreat. But how could an army trapped on a peninsula with no naval support possibly escape the clutches of the world's most powerful navy? The weather, which had been clear and hot throughout the battle, began to change as evening approached. Clouds gathered over Long Island Sound, and the wind shifted to the northeast, bringing with it the promise of rain and concealment. Washington, whose experience as a surveyor had taught him to read the signs of changing weather, began to formulate a plan so audacious that it bordered on the impossible, as documented in the personal correspondence of Colonel John Glover, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society. Washington's decision to attempt a nighttime evacuation across the East River represented one of the most daring military maneuvers in American history. The plan required perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and the kind of seaman-like skill that only the Marblehead fishermen in Glover's regiment possessed. The evacuation began at 10 o'clock on the night of August 29th, under cover of darkness. and a providential fog that had rolled in from the sea. Glover's Massachusetts fishermen, men who had learned their trade in the dangerous waters of the North Atlantic, began the delicate task of ferrying an entire army across a mile of tidal water, while British sentries stood guard just hundreds of yards away. The operation was a masterpiece of military deception and seamanship. Artillery pieces were wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of their movement, and strict silence was maintained as regiment after regiment slipped away from the Brooklyn Heights fortifications. The fog, which had seemed like a curse during the day's fighting, now became a blessing that concealed American movements from British observation. By dawn on August 30th, the impossible had been achieved. The entire Continental Army, with all its artillery and supplies, had been evacuated across the East River to the safety of Manhattan. The British, expecting to deliver the final blow to American resistance, discovered empty fortification and the bitter knowledge that their prey had escaped in the night. The Battle of Long Island had ended in tactical defeat, but strategic survival. Washington's army, though bloodied and demoralized, remained intact and capable of continuing the fight. The lesson of Brooklyn Heights would echo through American military doctrine for generations, that sometimes the greatest victory lies not in defeating the enemy, but in preserving the means to fight another day. The revolution would continue, tested by fire and tempered by defeat, but still alive with the promise that free men could govern themselves, without kings or nobles to rule over them. The largest battle of the Revolutionary War had ended, but the test of American independence had only just begun.